どうもすいません、飛び入りでマイク参加させていただきます。はい、どうも皆さん、イスラエルがパレスチナにやってる虐殺、ムカつきませんか？皆さん、ムカつきますよね。許せないでしょ。で、私こんなラッパーみたいな格好してるんですけれども、一応イスラエル・パレスチナ問題について専門的な記事を書いてたり、ジャーナリストみたいなことをやっております。 JT3 リローデッドと言います。本名川口智也です。でですね、本日ちょっと、そのムカつきも加えてちょっと知ってほしい、初心者にも分かりやすいことを述べたいと思います。マスコミは、大手マスコミは今ガザ地区でのイスラエルの虐殺について、ハマス、テロリストのハマスがいるからこれはしょうがないことだって何回も言ってますよね。だから子供を殺してもいいんだ、この虐殺はしょうがないことだって知ってます？これ陰謀論でもなくて、ザ・インターセプトという新聞社が暴いたことなんですけれども、現在のテロリストと言われているハマスに資金提供してハマスを作ったのってイスラエル政府なんですよ。これイーツァーク・セゲル准将っていう1980年代にガザの司令官をやっていた、ガザでイスラエル軍の司令官をやっていたイーツァー・セゲル准将っていうイスラエル軍の高官がインターセプトの雑誌ではっきりとハマスを作ったのはイスラエルだって言ってるんですよね。こういうことを全くメディアを報道しない。他にもガザ地区を担当してたイスラエル軍だったイスラエル関係者がハマスはイスラエルが作ったって言ってるんです。なんだったら近年のイスラエルの左派系新聞、ハーレツ新聞っていうのがあります。ハーレツ紙っていうのがあります。ハーレツ紙でハマスはカタール政府から資金援助を得てるんですけれども、それをネタニヤフは知ってて資金も停止することもできたのに、ネタニヤフはハマスへの資金提供をずっと資金提供を止めなかったってイスラエルの新聞が暴いてるんですよ。俺が言いたいのは、テロリストってどっちだよ。お前らイスラエルがハマスのテロリスト組織をお前らの国際法違反の入植侵略を正当化するためにハマスに資金提供してるんじゃないかってでしょ。もっと言いましょうか。あれでこういう反応してくる人いるじゃないですか。ハマスはテロリストだからしょうがないんだって、この犠牲はあって。じゃあ皆さんガザ地区のイスラエルによって忘れてますけれども、じゃあだよ、西ヨルダン地区ウェストバンク、ガザ地区じゃないウェストバンクにハマスはいません。でも過去からずっとイスラエル軍はそのガザではない西ヨルダン川西岸でもパレスチナ人の家を破壊したりパレスチナ人を殺したりしてるんです。ハマスがいないのに。ハマスのせいでお前ら戦争やってんじゃないのって。違うだろって。ハマス以外のパレスチナ地域でもお前らずーっと10月7日前からずーっと虐殺してるだろって。でこれ勘違いしないでくださいね。皆さん10月7日にこのイスラエルの虐殺は始まったっていう認識の人が多いと思います。違うからって。イスラエルの建国前からもうテールやシームラの虐殺でウィキペディアで調べてください。イスラエルは建国前からパレスチナ人の無差別虐殺をずーっとやってきてるんです。テロリストはハマスではありません。テロリストはあそこにいるイスラエル国家なんです。それを絶対に忘れないでください。で最後にちょっと長くなっちゃうんだけど、最後にじゃあみんなイスラエルのボイコットとかいいですよ、やってるじゃないですか。イスラエルのブドウをボイコットしようとか素晴らしいことですよ。ただイスラエルはびくともしない。であと日本にはやっぱりこういう虐殺にイスラエルにやってる虐殺は日本とは無関係だと思ってるかもしれません。違うんです。パレスチナ自治区というのは実験場なんです。いいですか。これ陰謀論でもないですよ。ユダヤ人のジャーナリストが言ってることですからね。いいですか。イスラエルというのはパレスチナ人を 何十年も南アフリカのアパルトヘイトみたいな人権弾圧してます。それをなんでやってるかというと、最先端のテクノロジーでやっております。ですんでですね、そのパレスチナ人を殺したデータとか子供たちを虐殺したデータとかも現在進行形でそのテクノロジーなんかを世界中に輸出してるんです。例挙げましょうか。これ星が絶対に言わないことね。ウイグル自治区で人権弾圧してる中国、あれを監視するためのテクノロジー、ウイグル人を弾圧するためのテクノロジー、あれユダヤ人のこれ CBS の記者が言ってるんだよね。あれはイスラエルがパレスチナ人を虐殺したり人権弾圧してパレスチナ人に実験したテクノロジーを中国に渡してるんです。 OK、 了解です。すいません。要は日本も同じです。日本も今岸田内閣が軍事費2倍とかやってるでしょ。あれで NTT セキュリティっていう会社が恩恵を受けてるんですけども、 NTT セキュリティは虐殺しているイスラエルと契約を結んでいます。ごめんなさい。すいません、失礼しました。要はイスラエルは世界中に人権弾圧を輸出してるんです。イスラエルも絶対これじゃありません。すいません、失礼しました。
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Palestine Laboratory, How Israel Exports the Technology of Occupation Around the World. That's the title of a new book by the Australian journalist Antony Loewenstein, who examines how Israel's military-industrial complex has used the occupied Palestinian territories for decades, he says, as a testing ground for weaponry and surveillance technology that they then export around the world. Antony Loewenstein is the author of a number of books, including Disaster Capitalism and My Israel Question. He was based in East Jerusalem between 2016 and 2020. His most recent article for the Sydney Morning Herald is Being Jewish and Critical of Israel Can Make You an Outcast. I Should Know. Antony is joining us from Sydney, Australia. We welcome you to Democracy Now!, Antony. Your book has just come out. What do you mean by the term the Palestine Laboratory?
Thanks so much for having me on, Amy. What I mean by that is that the occupation of Palestine by Israel is now the longest occupation in modern times, 56 years and counting. There's obviously been an occupation of sorts since 1948, but particularly since 1967. And during those years, what Israel has done very successfully from its perspective is find various tools and technologies to maintain and control Palestinians. And what they've done during that time, what Israel's done, is increasingly export those tools and technologies, but also those methods, those so-called counterinsurgency methods. So what I look at in the book, both being on the ground in Palestine for many years and also through declassified documents and various interviews across the world, is that you find in over 130 countries across the globe in the last decades, Israel has sold forms of anything from spyware, so-called smart walls, facial recognition tools, a range of tools of occupation and repression that have initially been tested in Palestine on Palestinians. So, in other words, what I'm saying is that the occupation of Palestine is not staying there. It's not a conflict that remains geographically based just in Palestine. It's become so-called global Palestine.
How would you describe politicide, a term you use?
Politicide, I think, was a term that was coined by Baruch Kimmerling, who is now the late amazing academic. And he was talking really about the concept of a desire within many in the Israeli elite to find ways to destroy Palestinians. That not necessarily just through killing them, but also through extinguishing their political identity, their political self-determination. And when looking at it from the outside, one could argue that in some ways Palestinian resistance lives on. Your last segment talked about that very strongly. Palestinians mostly have not left Palestine, they remain there. But certainly from the current Israeli government, and I would argue for decades, there has been a sense that there's a way to crush Palestinian aspirations, their views, their political reality, their future, their horizon. And by doing so, Israel has increasingly marketed that to a global audience, including in its whole identity as an ethno-nationalist state. It's arguably the most successful ethno-nationalist state in the world, a Jewish supremacist state. And growing numbers of nations around the world, from India and others, look to Israel with admiration and inspiration.
We just covered Modi and the lavish reception he got by the President of the United States, Biden, with the state dinner last night, the joint session of Congress. Talk about a little more about how India looks to Israel.
Look, what India is doing under Modi, of course, is not solely because of Israel, but traditionally Israel and India were not particularly good friends. But in the last 10 years or so, since Modi took power in 2014, there's been a real ideological alignment. But the relationship is really twofold. One, it's a defense relationship. So India buys huge amounts of technology, defense equipment, spyware. I interview a number of people in my book, individuals in India, lawyers, others, who are spied on by Israeli spyware, particularly Pegasus, by NSO Group. But also there's an ideological alignment, a belief that many Indian officials in the Hindu fundamentalist government there are openly talking about admiration for what Israel's doing in the West Bank and wanting to do something similar in Kashmir. And what I mean by that is they say that two reasons. One, because Israel gets away with it, no one's stopping it. There's a complete state of impunity that Israel has globally, really. But secondly, this idea of bringing in, according to India's view, huge numbers of Hindus to Muslim-majority Kashmir, to settle that territory, to build so-called settlements akin to what Israel's doing in the West Bank. And I think there's a really disturbing ideological alignment. I would actually make the comparison between Israel and India today to Israel and apartheid South Africa back in the day. Nations that were very, very close ideologically and got inspiration from each other, in the belief, in Israel's case, of course, being a Jewish supremacist state, and India's case being increasingly a Hindu fundamentalist state. And that, to me, is something that should concern people, including the US president.
So, Antony, you talk about a Jewish supremacist state. I'm wondering if you could talk about your own background, something that you take on in this last piece you wrote. Being Jewish and critical of Israel can make you an outcast, I should know. And talk about your family, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, those who died in Auschwitz, those who didn't survive the Holocaust.
Most of my family, sadly, Amy, like most Jews who lived in Europe, perished in the Holocaust, including Auschwitz. And the ones who got out and escaped Europe, particularly in 1939, just before the war started, escaped to wherever they were given a visa, Australia, Canada, the US, elsewhere. And the ones who came to Australia, when I was growing up, I was born in the mid-70s in Melbourne. Israel was not the center of their lives, but Israel was seen as a safe haven. For those who don't know, as a Jew, I can go to Israel tomorrow, and within a few months, I can almost certainly be a Jewish citizen if I can prove that I'm Jewish. And I think for many Jews, including my family, there was a real reluctance and, in fact, a hostility to any kind of Palestinian reality, Palestinian story, even to meet Palestinians. I mean, as a young Jew, I never met Palestinians. And I think there is a change going on, but certainly when I started writing about this issue, around 20 years ago, I wrote a book in 2006 called My Israel Question, where there were attempts by the Israel lobby in Australia to censor the book. There was attempts to pulp the book. There was condemnations of me in Parliament. I mean, it was ridiculous. The book became a bestseller thanks to all that ridiculous controversy. But over that time, my parents, both of whom lost most of their Jewish friends because it was the sins of the son. I was being critical of Israel. I was trying to humanize Palestinians. Now, I'm not the only Jew, of course, who was saying this, and I'm really encouraged in the last years. In Australia, the US and other Western countries are growing almost like a Jewish insurgency against particularly an older generation of Jews who doesn't want to humanize Palestinians and somehow believes that Jewish identity should be tied to Jewish supremacy. And so for me personally, I don't claim to be a victim. That story that you referenced at the beginning sort of gives a bit of a potted history of my life, but also explains that one does pay a price for it. One does pay a price as a Jewish person. I'm a secular anti-Zionist Jew today, but I feel often that there is a real moral collapse in much of the Jewish diaspora in the last decades. It is changing, but not nearly fast enough.
Antony, we were talking about the horrific shipwreck last week of migrants, maybe up to 700 dead. Can you talk about Israeli technology used by the European Union to surveil and target asylum seekers?
This really shocked me, years ago when I started doing some work on this issue. The short version is that the European Union in the last years after 2015, when they were, in their view, overwhelmed by particularly Muslim refugees from Syria, Afghanistan and elsewhere, didn't want to ever repeat that. And they put in place almost a fortress-type Europe, which has occurred in the last years, which is a range of tools and technologies to keep people out, mostly Muslim and brown and black bodies, of course. And part of that arsenal is using Israeli drones. They're unarmed, but they are flying over the Mediterranean 24/7, and they're used mostly by Frontex, which is the EU's sort of border security arm. And they're the eyes in the sky, essentially. So they are sending back all these images 24/7 to Warsaw, which is where Frontex is based. And the EU has made a decision, of course they don't admit this, but this is the reality, of letting people drown. This is the new policy. There are very, very few rescue boats. The EU barely rescues anyone. There are some NGOs that are trying to do so, and I deeply admire what they're doing. So the Israeli drone becomes a key arsenal and part of this infrastructure of essentially allowing people to drown. And to me, it really goes to the heart of why Israeli drones are used by the EU, because they were battle tested in Palestine over Gaza in a number of years in the last 15 years. And you see this almost Israeli border industrial complex exported across the US-Mexico border, for example. There are massive amounts of Israeli surveillance towers made by Elbit, which is Israel's leading defense company, dotted across the border. It's a key part of the US arsenal across its border with Mexico. And why was that company chosen by the US? Because, of course, it was tested first in Palestine. So to me, the real concern in the 21st century is, as the climate crisis worsens, as resource wars are worsening, as refugee numbers have never been higher since World War II, many Western nations are sadly making a choice to not welcome people in, as we saw with the recent awful shipwreck or disaster in the Mediterranean, but in fact to build higher walls and more surveillance. And Israeli surveillance and technology and repression is part of that arsenal that many nations are now buying, because it's been used in their view, successfully on Palestinians in Palestine.
And do you have evidence of the United States in particularly controversial situations working with Israel to perhaps have, for example, in Guatemala, Israel work there so that the United States won't be held responsible?
Absolutely. One of the things I document in the book really clearly is that over the last 50 years, a lot of nations that the US was close to, Israel almost became an American wingman, often supporting, arming, training nations the US even couldn't do officially because of some issue maybe in Congress. And that did include nations like Guatemala, including at a point where they were committing genocide against their indigenous populations. And one of the reasons that many of those nations, Guatemala, Honduras, Chile, under Pinochet, a range of other nations in Latin and South America, although of course it went far further, including in Africa and Asia, was that these nations were really attracted by the idea of learning the so-called skills that Israel was gaining through its occupation after 1967. How is it managing the Palestinian population? How is it repressing them, essentially? And there's huge amounts of evidence through declassified documents and interviews, much of which is in the book, which really goes to the heart of showing that the US and Israel became almost like invaluable partners during that period, to the point where today, look, America remains the world's biggest arms dealer. 40% of the world's arms is sold by the US. Israel is now 10th. And just last week, in fact, Israel released its 2022 arms figures, 12.5 billion US, the biggest amount ever. And 25% of that was going to Arab autocracies after the so-called Abraham Accords, the Trump deal from a few years ago. So we're talking about Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, and others. So what are they selling? They're selling repressive technology, spyware, intelligence gathering, a range of other tools to prop up US and Israeli-backed dictatorships in the Middle East. So this is what the Israeli arms industry is about. Like, this to me is not just a moral failing, but a really dark stain on the Jewish legacy 75 years after the Holocaust. Like, this is what we've become. We, meaning the Jewish population of the world. The legacy seems to be backing and supporting and arming the worst regimes in the world.
Let me ask you about something you mentioned earlier, and that's NSO's Pegasus. Explain further how it's used and how it is used to infect the phones, for example, of journalists, some, for example, who are in jail, like in Morocco, as you talk about the Abraham Accords, Omar Hadi, who we interviewed before he was imprisoned and has been now for several years.
Pegasus got a lot of attention in the last years, as viewers will know, as probably the most known or infamous Israeli spyware. Essentially, it's a tool that allows any government or military intelligence or police department to spy on someone's phone, iPhone or Android, and get all the information from that phone. And it's popped up in dozens and dozens of countries around the world. And I spend a lot of time in the book interviewing some of the victims of that surveillance in Togo, for example, in Mexico, in India. And Mexico, interestingly enough, is the biggest user of Pegasus by far. There is an absolute addiction in Mexico, both under right-wing governments and the current nominally left-wing government. Governments don't want to give this tool up. And it's not just Pegasus. Of course, there are many other Israeli companies doing the same thing. But one of the things that I explore in the book is that so much of the media in the last years around Pegasus missed the key point. It was almost framed as a rogue Israeli company doing terrible things around the world, when in fact, companies like Pegasus actually are only private in name. They are basically arms of the state. Netanyahu and the Mossad, who have been going to various countries in the last 10 years. I document this in the book, and this has also been shown by Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper. Often go to nations like Saudi Arabia, Rwanda, and others, and they hold Pegasus and other tools as a diplomatic carrot. If you support us in the UN or elsewhere, we will sell you the most powerful spyware in the world. And it works because it's been sold in UAE and Saudi and Rwanda and many other repressive states. So unless there is a complete ban or massive regulation, which currently does not exist at all, these technologies will continue. And even if NSO Group disappears tomorrow and it's currently in financial crisis, many other companies do exactly the same thing, and which is why Israel is now one of the leading spyware exporters in the world.
Well, Antony Loewenstein, I want to thank you so much for being with us, author of the new book, The Palestine Laboratory, How Israel Exports the Technology of Occupation Around the World.